Well, if you recall where we are in the story, last week we engaged the story of Abraham and his journey of faith, which is really a key story in Genesis. It's a key story in the whole Bible. As Abraham becomes the father of many nations, we trace our spiritual lineage back to Abraham and his faith. We talked about the testing of his faith there on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22. God calls him to sacrifice his long-awaited son Isaac. Abraham is faithful, and at the last minute, God provides an alternative for him. But this is a movement of faith, and we've seen it through Abraham all the way through. And there's been this anticipation about the birth of Isaac for several chapters in Genesis. And then finally, Isaac is born. And we would expect his role to be more significant. Like, we've waited so long for him to come on board. But in many ways, his story just kind of acts as a bridge between Abraham and the story of Jacob, where this family is going to expand in a major way. Now, in Genesis 23, Abraham's wife Sarah dies. And one of the things Abraham does is he purchases a piece of land from the Hittites, who sort of own that area of Canaan. And that becomes sort of a down payment, if you will, on this promised land that's going to figure so prominently through the rest of the Old Testament. This is the land that Israel is going to come back to. It's the land that's going to be contested over and over again. But while Sarah has died, Isaac now is grown up. He needs a wife. And so there's a great story in Genesis 24 about one of Abraham's servants being sent back to Haran, where Abraham and his family were from, to go and get Isaac a wife. And it's a fascinating story. The servant goes back and he prays to God. The woman who comes to the well and waters me, gives me a drink and my camels a drink, that's going to be the one I'll bring back. So no dating, no Match.com, none of that stuff. It is all about the well. And that's an important piece. I did a video on that this past week if you want to find that on our YouTube page. Well, Rebekah comes back with the servant, and there's the great love story of Isaac walking through the field, and she sees him from a distance and slips down off of her camel. Actually, the Hebrew kind of implies that she fell off the camel. She was so enamored with Isaac, and they have this beautiful love story. But then we see, as we get to Genesis 25, that things are repeating themselves. Remember, Abraham and Sarah were barren. They had no children. It took God's intervention. And now at the beginning of Genesis 25, the same thing is happening with Isaac and Rebekah. If the next generation is going to continue, God is going to have to intervene as he did with Abraham. This is the repeated pattern. And it tells us that God is the one who's making possible this continuation of the covenant promise of family, land, and blessing. And despite all the twists and turns in these stories, with human beings acting timidly at best or as conniving backstabbers in the worst, God is in the background moving the story along for his purposes and for his covenant. One of the places we see this most clearly is in this famous story of Jacob and Esau, the twin sons born to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac prays on behalf of Rebekah, and she finally conceived and is pregnant with twins. We get a little foreshadowing of their relationship in verse 22, which tells us that the baby boys jostled each other within her, causing her not only physical discomfort, but a bit of a spiritual dilemma as well. So she went to inquire of the Lord. Now, we're not sure exactly how she did this, whether it was a simple prayer, whether she went to see an oracle or a prophet, which was common in the Old Testament world. However she received this word, God told her that the conflict in her womb was about more than just gestational space. It was a conflict of nations, a conflict where the covenant promise would land with this next generation. Who's going to carry this covenant promise forward? Look at verse 23. God says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now remember the Abraham story. that Ishmael was born to Sarah's servant Hagar, and he would become the father of a nation himself, but not the nation of promise, the family of the covenant. That was left to Isaac, whom God had promised to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. Now we have a similar conflict, but this time within the same family. And most unusually, the older will serve the younger. Now, how many of you out there are oldest children? There's a few of you out there. I'm with you. You know, the older kids are the golden children, aren't they? In so many ways, yeah, all the younger ones are going, yep, they sure are. That's a thing. We're the responsible ones, the ones who get all the stuff while the baby of the family gets all the babying. Although my wife is the baby of the family, she would dispute that. But we have this conflict. And then there's the middle child who doesn't quite know where they fit, and they're always fighting for a place in that way. But we oldest are the ones who get all the perks of being first. And that was no different in the ancient world. To be the oldest son was a huge advantage. Even if, as in the case of twins, you were born only minutes before the younger one, you are still the man. When the father died, you were entitled to a double portion of the inheritance. In other words, there are two sons, the inheritance is going to be divided into three, and the older son is going to get two of those portions. It was a big deal to be the oldest. But God's word to Rebekah, remember, was that the older child would serve the younger. That the real influence, the real covenant was going to go through the younger son. This is going to be another repeated pattern in Genesis, a sign that it is God who does the choosing of who carries the hopes of the family and the covenant promise, not simple human conventions. And so the twins are finally born, and they are a stark contrast. The first one to come out, the oldest by a minute or so, is named Esau. His body is red and hairy, and his name means hairy or rough. You know, we go through all this stuff of picking names, with our kids. They just kind of picked however they looked like or whatever their trait was. It makes it really simple. Hey, he's hairy, so we'll call him Harry. That's Esau. But the younger one is literally born on Esau's heel, grabbing his heel as he comes into the world. Jacob is a name that means heel grabber or supplanter. It can also mean, however, may God protect. That's a foreshadowing. It's another word play, an indicator of the kind of role that Jacob is going to play in the story. Now, these twin boys could not be more different. Now, if you have a couple kids in your family, you know that sometimes they are very, very different. Our daughter Hannah, for example, our oldest, she's very quiet and reserved, has a very wry sense of humor, while our son Robbie, we used to say he had no unspoken thoughts. They're complete opposites. You might see similar contrasts. And while you love them equally, parents do tend to naturally connect with one child more than the other. Esau grows up to be a rugged hunter, a man of the open country, the stereotypical man's man. We would imagine him wearing Realtree camouflage, driving an old F-150 with a gun rack on the back, with an ATV and a trailer behind, probably a dead deer somewhere in the bed of the truck. That's who he is. Jacob, on the other hand, is more of a mama's boy, one with refined tastes, a foodie who not only shops organic, but also enjoys being indoorsy. Isaac favored Esau because his son kept him supplied with a freezer full of tasty meat. Rebekah favored Jacob for his domestic sophistication. It's important to recognize here that the Bible does not suggest that this favoritism is bad or dysfunctional, nor does it make a value judgment at this point on whether it's better to be a hunter or a tent dweller. The real question is, through which of these brothers is the covenant going to move forward? Who has the capacity to maintain it? With whom can God do his best work? Well, we get a distinct contrast, but it's one that doesn't leave either one of them in a particularly good light. The scene shifts to the kitchen, where Jacob is preparing a lentil stew, a red soup that pretty common, but in the right context, it could seem as tasty as anything that Chef Gordon Ramsay might whip up in his kitchen. Esau has been out hunting, and like a spoiled child, is feeling a little bit of hunger, but somehow believes he is starving to death. You ever hear kids come to you, I am starving to death. I need food now, and it must be cookies. And so Esau comes bursting into the tent and says, quick, let me have some of that stew. I'm famished, starving to death. His mind is on one thing, his perceived need. Jacob, on the other hand, is not driven by impulse. He's driven by shrewdness. The text doesn't say this, but you have to imagine that Jacob, in his sophisticated way, probably from reading human psychology books in his ample spare time, knew that his slightly older brother was an emotional decision maker who was driven by his baser instincts. Verse 30 tells us that Esau was also called Edom, which means red. And that's going to be his legacy. A nation's going to come from him that will be Israel's enemy. And it's not hard to imagine that Jacob connivingly sets up everything that happens next. He knows this is his opportunity. And he exploits Esau's weakness for self-gratification by offering him an instant deal. Ah, yes, I would be happy to pour you a big bowl of my crimson consommé. But first, sell me your birthright. So this is the deal. Remember, a birthright, a double portion of the father's estate for a bowl of soup. Now, a rational person would look at the structure of this deal and realize that the cost-benefit analysis does not add up. Do you know what the most expensive bowl of soup in the world today is? I looked it up. There are several candidates. There's a shark fin soup that's served in Australia that's about $425 a bowl. There's another beef stew from a Chinese restaurant that is about $300. But the most expensive that I found is served at a restaurant called the Cosmopolitan in Las Vegas. It's cordyceps soup. Cordyceps, the main ingredient, is a caterpillar fungus called that since it resembles the fuzzy creatures. It has to be flown in from the Himalayas because this fungus only grows above 12,500 feet in elevation. Cordyceps is known as the Viagra of the Himalayas. It goes for $100 a gram or $45,000 a pound. There's a quarter ounce in every bowl of the soup served at the Cosmopolitan, along with other ingredients like the highly prized silky breed of chicken and Chinese dates. The cost for a single bowl of cordyceps soup, $700. They serve about 5 a month. That's expensive soup. But it's not the equivalent of 2/3 of the inheritance of the estate of a prosperous Middle Eastern patriarch, even one who lived 1,800 years before the time of Jesus. A pound of lentils, by contrast, is about $2. This is lentil stew. But in his self-gratifying, impulsive state of mind, Esau isn't doing the math. He isn't calculating the value. He wants what he wants, and he wants it now. Look, I'm about to die, he says. A little dramatic. What good is a birthright to me? He can only think in the moment. Jacob, on the other hand, has the long view in mind. The younger brother exploits his older brother's weakness, and the deal is made. Jacob makes Esau swear an oath, probably in front of witnesses, and that is binding. He sells his birthright for a bowl of soup. In verse 34, the verbs come as rapidly as Esau's rash decision-making. Look at this. He ate and drank, and then he got up and left. Similar kind of string of verbs If you remember, we saw in Genesis 3, when Eve was confronted with this tantalizing fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Remember what it says? She took, she ate, and she gave some to her husband who was with her. She exchanged God's blessing and the blessing of the tree of life for a simple taste, a momentary gratification. It's the tragedy of human short-sightedness and sin. It's selling out for something less. It's contempt for the good in favor of the pleasure of the now. The last line of this story is so telling. So Esau despised his birthright. We're left to ponder that statement and what it foreshadows. Esau is the oldest, the one through whom the family is supposed to continue and prosper. But he despises his birthright. So careless that he sells it for a momentary grasp of self-gratification. Just a spoonful. If he is so careless with something so materially valuable, it's clear he can't be trusted with something of infinitely more value. The covenant promises of God. Esau derails his future and his family for a momentary indulgence. And that still happens. It's a story that many of us can relate to, either having done it ourselves or seen someone else do it. That bowl of soup comes in a lot of different forms, doesn't it? And usually it's offered when we are at our weakest and most vulnerable. I once read that we are most tempted to take lopsided deals like this, to make rash decisions, emotional decisions, when we are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Many are the people, including many pastors, who have sold the value of a birthright in family, reputation, and finances because of a momentary desire. Sexual affairs, indiscriminate clicks on a web browser, dipping a hand into the company's money, overindulgence spending, those are just a few bowls of soup. We tend to crave those when we're famished physically or spiritually. But the bowl of soup is quickly consumed, and what's often left is wreckage. The wreckage of a family's future. Forgiveness is always on the horizon, remember, as we will see as the story continues. But the consequences of slurping down a bowl of self-gratifying soup can be long-lasting. Jesus warns us about this in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about lust, that when we look at someone, or we could extend it to something as well, with our own self-gratifying desires in mind, we commit adultery. We're cheating on a spouse, or in the bigger picture, we're cheating on the promises of God. And that's why Jesus proposes a radical kind of surgery to stop craving the soup. Look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 29. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose a part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, obviously, Jesus is speaking here with some hyperbole. Otherwise, we would be a very interesting looking group of people this morning. But the point is well made. It takes discipline to live the Christian life. It means guarding your desires. It means, as Paul says, taking every thought captive. It involves strict training. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 27, I make my body my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. We have to be willing to cut out the things that put us in a vulnerable place. You might have noticed that the hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, that vulnerability makes an acronym. I was in the Army. We do everything with acronyms. It spells what? H-A-L-T. Halt. Halt. And that's exactly what we should do when we are in those states. We need to halt, to stop, maybe even considering that the thing that we're craving, well, might just be a $2 bowl of soup. Is it worth all of this? Is it worth giving up everything? for a moment of indulgence. Esau didn't halt. He despised his birthright. We learn a couple chapters later that he's also cheated out of his father's blessing by Jacob, who, while Esau is out hunting and with his mother's encouragement, tricks his blind father into giving him, the younger brother, the blessing for the family instead. Isaac doesn't come off looking great in this particular story. He's blind. Jacob disguises himself, puts some goat skins on his arms and comes in, and Isaac's like, "Are you my son Esau?" "Oh yeah, that's who I am. Yeah, give me the blessing." And he does, and Esau comes back in and realizes the blessing as well as his birthright has been given away, and he's furious. He wants to kill Jacob. And while Esau is impulsive and rash, Jacob doesn't come off well in these stories either, does he? He's conniving, he's manipulative. He's the opposite end of the spectrum from Esau. The sibling rivalry that had characterized the first generation after Adam and Eve. Remember, Cain kills Abel. Now we're seeing it rear its ugly head again. Esau wants to kill Jacob. Jacob's going to have to run for his life. Jacob himself doesn't seem worthy of carrying the covenant blessing. But as we will see, he's going to be open to learn. And that's really what it comes down to. Are we open to taking the long view of carrying forth the covenant promise of God in our own lives? Are we willing to discipline ourselves to be in this walk of faith for the long haul? Can we learn from the mistakes that we've made? Can we discipline ourselves to halt when we're vulnerable? We can learn a lot from this story and from our experiences and those of others. It's one of the reasons God gives us the church, so that, as John Wesley put it, we can watch over one another in love. The opening scene of the Jacob story reveals that despite human imperfection and failure, God is willing to work with those who have a long-term view. People who will not despise the birthright, the eternal inheritance that God has offered them for the equivalent of a bowl of soup. The good news, however, is that even if we have failed like Esau, God does not abandon us. There is forgiveness. There's reconciliation. But it's also a long road to walk. Better to not take the deal in the first place. Better to prefer a blessing to a bowl of soup.